$305 trillion. That is the total amount of debt sitting on the books of governments, corporations, and households around the world right now. To put that into perspective, if you stacked 305 trillion $1 bills on top of each other, the pile would stretch from Earth to the sun and back. More than 100 times now. Here's what nobody asks. Why? Not how did debt get this big? Not who owes what? But why does the global financial system seem to require this much debt to function? Why is it that every single decade, without exception, global debt gets larger? Why is it that countries that try to escape the debt cycle, particularly developing nations, end up drowning deeper in it? The answer isn't incompetence. It isn't laziness. And it isn't bad luck. The answer is a deal, a very specific deal, made by a small group of men in a mountain resort in New Hampshire in the summer of 1944, a deal so consequential that its fingerprints are on every financial crisis you've heard of, from Argentina's collapse to Greece's decade of austerity. To the debt spirals tearing through Africa right now, most people have never heard of it. And the people who set it up, they believed, genuinely, that they were saving the world. They were wrong, the world on fire, and the men who wanted to rebuild it to understand the trap. You have to understand the world that built it. It is July 1944. World War II is not. Yet over today happened just weeks ago. But the most powerful economic minds on the planet are already meeting, not on a battlefield, but in a luxury hotel called the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 730 delegates, 44 nations, and to men who hated each other's vision for the future. The first was John Maynard Keynes, the most celebrated economist of the 20th century, a British aristocrat who genuinely believed that the world needed a neutral global currency, something he called the Bancor, so that no single nation could dominate international trade. Under his plan, countries that ran large surpluses would be penalized, not rewarded. The system would balance itself. No country would get too powerful. No country would get crushed under debt. The second was Harry Dexter White, the U.S. Treasury's chief international economist, a tough, sharp, politically connected civil servant who had one overriding goal: make sure the United States emerged from World War II as the undisputed center of the global financial system. Keynes wanted balance. White wanted dominance. White won. What they created was called the Bretton Woods Agreement. On the surface, it was elegant. All currencies in the world would be pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar would be pegged to gold, at exactly $35 per ounce. Stable, predictable, safe. Two new institutions were also born from those July meetings. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, designed to help countries facing short-term payment crises, and the World Bank, designed to fund long-term reconstruction and development. It all sounded reasonable, even noble. But embedded in the architecture of this new world order were three hidden mechanisms, three slow-acting poisons, and it would take decades before the world understood what it had swallowed. Let's pull back the curtain. On each one, origins, rise, breaking point, fallout, and the failed fixes to understand the first hidden mechanism. You need to understand something counterintuitive about power. Under Bretton Woods, every country in the world needed U.S. dollars to trade internationally. Oil, priced in dollars. Wheat, dollars. Steel, dollars. If you were Japan or France or Brazil and you wanted to buy something from another country, you first had to get dollars, and to get dollars. You had to either earn them through exports or borrow them. This gave the United States something extraordinary: the ability to print money that the whole world needed. Economists call this exorbitant privilege. France's finance minister, Charles de Gaulle's advisor, Jacques Rueff, was furious about it. He called it a system that allowed America to run deficits for free, to live beyond its means at everyone else's expense. De Gaulle was so angry that in 1965, he literally sent a French warship to New York Harbor, loaded with dollars, to demand gold in return. It was a protest, a defiant theatrical act of resistance against a system he believed was fundamentally rigged. He wasn't wrong, but he was too early. Through the late 1950s and 1960s, the United States was spending money it didn't have: the Vietnam War, the space race, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. The US was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. By 1971, the numbers were frightening. There were roughly $80 billion in dollar claims held by foreign governments, but the US only had about $12 billion in gold. The system was mathematically insolvent. Foreign governments, led by France, began demanding gold. And in August of 1971, President Richard Nixon did something that shocked the entire world. He closed the gold window unilaterally, without consulting a single ally, without convening any international body. The United States simply announced that dollars could no longer be converted into gold. The foundational promise of Bretton Woods, the entire basis on which the world had agreed to use the dollar as its reserve currency, was canceled overnight. This moment is called the Nixon shock, and it should have ended dollar dominance. It should have forced a new international monetary conference. It should have given Keynes's vision of a balanced, neutral global currency system another chance. It didn't, because of oil. 2 years after the Nixon shock, in the chaos following the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and the OPEC oil embargo, a secret deal was struck. The details were hidden from the public for decades and only confirmed in declassified documents. Released years later, the United States approached Saudi Arabia with a proposition. The U.S. would provide military protection and guarantee the Saudi royal family's security. In exchange, Saudi Arabia, and through diplomatic pressure, the rest of OPEC would price all oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars, and they would recycle their oil profits, called petrodollars, back into U.S. Treasury bonds. The gold standard was dead, but dollar dominance had just found a new engine. Oil. Every country on earth needed oil. And now, to buy oil, you needed dollars. The trap snapped shut again, this time even tighter. Now we come to the second hidden mechanism, and this one is more sinister than the first. Remember the IMF, that institution born at Bretton Woods, supposedly designed to help countries in financial distress. Here's how it worked in practice. When a developing country ran into trouble, a currency crisis, a trade deficit, a shock in commodity prices, it would go to the IMF and ask for help. The IMF would say yes, but attached to that yes was a list of conditions, non-negotiable conditions. They called this conditionality. And those conditions almost always looked like this: privatize state-owned enterprises, sell off the national oil company, sell the water utility, sell the electricity grid, usually to foreign corporations at knockdown prices, cut government spending, fire public workers, reduce subsidies on food, fuel, and medicine, the things poor people depend on, raise interest rates, make money expensive to attract foreign investment, even if it crushes domestic businesses. Open your markets. Remove all trade barriers, so foreign goods can flood in, even if it destroys local industry. These policies had a name: adjustment programs, or SAPs, between 1980 and 2000. The IMF and World Bank imposed structural adjustment programs on more than 90 developing countries. And in virtually every case, the results followed the same pattern: short-term financial stabilization, followed by deindustrialization, followed by increased poverty, followed by more borrowing to cover the new deficits created by privatization and spending cuts, followed by another crisis. It was a trap with revolving doors. The 1980s is what economists politely call the debt crisis. What regular people experienced was something closer to economic warfare. In Latin America, country after country collapsed. Mexico in 1982, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia. Per capita income across the continent fell back to where it had been in the 1960s. An entire generation's worth of development. Erased in sub-Saharan Africa, it was even worse. By 1986, Africa's debt stood at over $200 billion. Much of it borrowed from Western banks, flush with petrodollars in the 1970s, at interest rates that seemed reasonable when they were fixed, until the U.S. Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, raised rates to nearly 20% in 1981. Let that sink in. Countries in Africa had borrowed money at reasonable rates. And then, because of a policy decision made thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., the interest on that debt nearly quadrupled. They had no vote, no warning, no say. And when they couldn't pay, the IMF arrived, not with relief, but with structural adjustment programs, which cut the very spending those countries needed to dig themselves out. Tanzania's president, Julius Nyerere, watching his country's hospitals close and schools go unfunded under IMF conditions, asked a question that became famous. Nobody in Washington had a satisfying answer. By the 1990s, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Something was deeply wrong. Academic economists, NGOs, and even some people inside the World Bank began publishing damning research. A landmark 1993 World Bank report, a report the institution tried to suppress, admitted that in many African countries, structural adjustment had made poverty worse, not better. Pressure mounted. By 2000, a coalition of celebrities, churches, and activists under the banner of Jubilee 2000 had collected 24 million signatures, demanding debt cancellation for the world's poorest nations. It was one of the largest global petitions in history. The response was the HIPC initiative, the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Program. Debt relief. Finally, the world cheered. Except the fine print told a different story to qualify for HIPC. Debt relief, countries had to complete, you guessed it, a structural adjustment program. They had to privatize. They had to cut spending. They had to open their markets. The debt relief was conditional on doing the very things that had gotten them into trouble. And the relief itself, it canceled some debt, yes. But it was structured in ways that kept countries dependent on international creditors. New loans were issued to replace old ones. The cycle continued. It was like offering a drowning man a life preserver attached to an anchor. Now here's where it gets uncomfortably close to home, because you might be thinking, this is history. The worst of it is over. The world has learned. It hasn't. As of 2024, 93 countries are in active IMF programs, 93 more than at any previous point in history. Sri Lanka declared bankruptcy in 2022. Its IMF deal, signed in 2023, requires reducing the public wage bill, raising energy prices, and cutting welfare programs. Hundreds of thousands of public workers faced job losses. Sound familiar? Ghana defaulted on its international debt in late 2022. Its IMF program, finalized in 2023, included raising taxes, cutting energy subsidies, and reducing the public payroll. Citizens who had nothing to do with the borrowing decisions are bearing the full cost. Pakistan, Egypt, Tunisia, Ethiopia, Zambia, the list goes on. And here's the number that ties it all together. Since 1970, the combined external debt of low and middle-income countries has grown from approximately $100 billion to over $9 trillion. Not in absolute terms, adjusted for inflation. $9 trillion, 90 times larger. In 50 years, the system does not reduce debt. The system produces debt. That is what it was designed to do. And the machinery driving this is subtler today, but structurally identical to 1944. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, accounting for roughly 58% of global foreign exchange reserves. This means most countries still need to earn or borrow dollars to conduct international trade, which means they are still, to varying degrees, subject to interest rate decisions made by the U.S. Federal Reserve, a central bank that has no mandate to consider the effect of its decisions on Sri Lanka, or Zambia, or Argentina. When the Fed raises rates, as it did, aggressively in 2022 and 2023, capital flows out of developing countries back to the United States. Currencies crash, and suddenly countries that had manageable debt face payment crises, not because of anything they did, because of what happened in a building in Washington, D.C. This is what economists call dollar hegemony, and it is the direct child of that deal made in New Hampshire in 1944. Meanwhile, a new actor has entered the scene: China. Over the past 2 decades, China's Belt and Road Initiative has lent hundreds of billions of dollars to developing countries, often for infrastructure projects with fewer political conditions than IMF programs. Some celebrate this as an alternative. Others warn it is the same trap, with a different flag on it. In Zambia, Chinese lenders held a significant portion of the debt. When the country defaulted in 2020, Zambia spent 3 years in debt, restructuring negotiations caught between Western creditors, Chinese creditors, and IMF conditions. While ordinary Zambians waited, the names of the creditors change. The dynamic doesn't. So let's step back. Three things emerge clearly from all of this, and they are worth stating plainly. First, the international financial system was not designed for equality. It was designed for stability, on terms favorable to the most powerful nations at the time of its creation. Bretton Woods was built by men who had just survived a world war and a Great Depression. Their instinct was to build something that would prevent another catastrophe, and in many ways, they succeeded. There was no World War III, and the post-war economic boom was real. But in locking in dollar dominance and creating institutions with built-in power asymmetries, they also locked in a hierarchy. Countries, at the top of that hierarchy, get to play by different rules. Countries at the bottom, they get the conditionality clause. Second, debt relief without structural change is not relief. It is renegotiation. Every major debt relief initiative of the past 40 years, from the Brady Plan of the 1980s to HIPC to current restructuring talks, has followed the same pattern. Some debt is canceled or rescheduled. New conditions are attached. New loans are issued. The cycle continues until the conditions attached to international lending fundamentally change, until developing countries have genuine power in these negotiations rather than accept or collapse choices. Debt relief is not a solution. It is a management strategy for a problem the system has no interest in solving. Third, the cost of this system is measured in human lives, not spreadsheet entries. When a country cuts its health budget because of IMF conditions, real children die from diseases that were preventable. When a food subsidy is removed, real families cannot eat. When public teachers are fired, real children don't learn. These are not abstract economic adjustments, and the people who make these decisions in Washington, in Brussels, in Beijing, are rarely the ones who bear the consequences. Now, for the uncomfortable question, the one this whole story has been building toward: is there an alternative? Economists have proposed many: a genuine international reserve currency, not controlled by any single nation. Debt jubilees for the poorest countries. Restructured IMF voting systems that give developing nations real power. Trade frameworks that don't penalize countries for protecting nascent industries. Some of these ideas are technically feasible. The problem is political. The countries that benefit most from the current system, the United States, the European Union, Japan, have the most votes at the IMF and the World Bank. Reform requires the powerful to voluntarily relinquish advantage. History doesn't give many examples of that happening without a crisis, and here's the warning embedded in all of this. The debt levels in the global financial system right now, that $305 trillion figure we opened with, are unprecedented. They are not a sign of prosperity. They are a sign of fragility. In 2008, a debt crisis in the U.S. mortgage market nearly collapsed the global economy. The response was more debt. Governments borrowed to bail out banks, and central banks printed trillions more. The next crisis will not be contained in a single sector or a single country. It will be systemic. And the poorest countries, the ones who are already deepest in the trap built in 1944, will be the first to fall. The deal made at Mount Washington Hotel was supposed to prevent another Great Depression. What it may have done instead is build a bigger one in slow motion over 8 decades while most of the world looked away.